You are not Thomas Reed." The words left Amelia Hartwell's mouth before she could stop them. Sharp, public, humiliating, and the entire station turned to look. The stranger didn't flinch. He just removed his hat slowly, and she saw the scar. She saw the gun. Her chest caved in. 3 years of fighting alone. Months of letters. One blue dress she had saved for this moment. And the man standing before her was not her husband. He was something far more dangerous. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Amelia Hartwell had not cried in 3 years. Not when her father died with debts stacked higher than the barn roof. Not when the banker Gerald Morse had sat across from her at his polished desk and told her with barely concealed satisfaction that a woman alone could not legally hold title to her own land without a male co-signer or a husband named on the property deed. Not when she had gone home that night, sat at her kitchen table, and realized that everything her father had built, every fence post, every acre of grass, every cattle trail worn into the earth by 2 generations of Hartwells, could be taken from her before spring. She had not cried. She had made a list. That was who Amelia was. Practical to the bone. Her mother had died when she was 9 years old, and her father had raised her the way he knew how, with work, with silence, with the understanding that the land did not care about your feelings, only your effort. She had learned early that grief was a luxury, and she had never fully allowed herself the expense. So when the crisis arrived, she did not cry. She sat down, she wrote out her options, and she crossed off the ones that led nowhere. Selling the ranch crossed off. She would rather burn it to the ground than hand it to men who had waited 20 years for her family to fail. Hiring a lawyer crossed off. She had spoken to 2 already. Both had told her the same thing in different words. The territorial law was clear, and the bank's position was legally sound. Without a man's name beside hers on that deed, she was a woman managing a property she did not legally own. Finding a business partner crossed off. Every man she approached either wanted to buy her out or assumed that a partnership meant eventual ownership. No one wanted to stand beside her. Everyone wanted to stand above her. Which left one option. A husband. Not a romantic partner, not a dream, not any of the soft things she had quietly given up on after the 3rd year of fighting alone. Just a legal arrangement. A man willing to lend his name to a document, respect the agreement, and let her run her own land. The Wyoming Territorial Marriage Agency operated out of Cheyenne, and its advertisements promised exactly that: practical matches for practical people on the frontier. Amelia had written to them with the same tone she used for bank correspondence. Direct, specific. She listed what she needed and what she could offer in return: a working ranch fair division of labor, and the guarantee that she would honor any agreement made in writing. Within 6 weeks, she had received 3 responses. She chose Thomas Reed. His letter was 3 pages long, written in a careful, slightly cramped hand that told her he was not a man who wrote often, but took the effort seriously when he did. He was 41 years old, a rancher from Montana who had recently lost his own land to a bad winter and a worse bank loan. He was looking for a fresh start. He was not looking for a woman to manage. He said that plainly, without being asked. I have known strong women my whole life and found them easier to work with than most men. I would not insult you by trying to run something you have already been running for years. That line had made her stop reading for a full minute. She read it 3 more times. Then she wrote back. Their correspondence over the following 4 months was careful and honest, and occasionally even warm. Thomas Reed told her about his late wife Clara, who had died of fever 7 years earlier. He told her about the Montana winters. He told her about a cattle dog named Bishop, who had been his only company for the past 2 years, and asked if she minded dogs on the property. She had written back that she minded dogs in the house, but not in the barn, and he had responded that Bishop was a barn dog anyway, and this detail had pleased her more than she expected, because it meant he had actually read what she wrote. He was not a complicated man. He did not pretend to be more than he was. And when he wrote in his second-to-last letter, I cannot promise I will be the man you hoped for, but I can promise I will try to be the man you need." She had folded that letter and placed it in the wooden box beside her bed where she kept her father's watch. The morning of April the 14th, Amelia Hartwell put on her blue dress. She had owned it for 4 years and worn it exactly twice. It was not an extravagant dress. There was nothing extravagant about Amelia, but it was the only dress she owned that could not be mistaken for a work garment. It was the color of a sky just before full light, and her father had bought it for her when she turned 22, and said she deserved something that wasn't the color of mud. She wore it to the station. She told herself it meant nothing, a practical decision. A first impression was a professional matter, and this was a professional arrangement, and there was no reason to read sentiment into a choice of clothing. She arrived at the Millhaven station 45 minutes early. The train was not due until 9:30. She stood on the platform and told herself to breathe. What she had not accounted for was the town. She had not told anyone about the arrangement, or rather, she had not made an announcement. But Millhaven was a small town, and small towns had their own intelligence network. And apparently someone at the post office had said something to someone's wife, who had said something to the pastor who had mentioned it at last Sunday service, and by the morning of April the 14th, the platform at Millhaven Station was occupied by roughly 24 people who had come specifically to watch Amelia Hartwell receive her husband. She recognized all of them. Margaret Coalfield, who ran the general store and had twice offered to buy Amelia's east pasture at an insultingly low price. The Dunbar brothers, who had inherited neighboring land and had made it quietly clear they expected her to fail eventually. A group of young women from the church who watched her with a complicated mixture of sympathy and judgment that she found harder to bear than open hostility. And standing slightly apart from the crowd with a slight smirk, he didn't bother to hide Gerald Morse the banker, waiting to see how this played out. Amelia straightened her spine and looked at the tracks. The train arrived at 9:34. She watched the passenger car doors open. She watched people step down. A traveling salesman with too much luggage, a young family mother-father, 2 children who immediately ran toward the water trough, an older woman in mourning dress who was met by a tearful younger woman she recognized as the new schoolteacher's sister. She watched. The platform crowd watched her watching. More passengers descended. And then the car was empty. For one suspended moment, Amelia stood very still and thought, he missed the train. That's all. He missed the train, and there will be a telegram waiting at the station office, and he will arrive on Thursday's train, and this is not the end of anything. Then a figure appeared in the doorway of the passenger car. Not Thomas Reed. She had studied Thomas Reed's photograph until she knew every line of it. A broad-shouldered man with a round open face and a gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled. A man who looked like someone's favorite uncle. A man who looked safe. The figure in the doorway was not that man. He was tall, genuinely tall. Not the kind of height that came from boots and posture, but structural bone-deep height that made the doorframe look modest. He wore a coat the color of old leather, road-worn and trail-stained. His face was angular and hard, and there was a scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, pale against his skin, not fresh, but not entirely settled, either the kind of mark that took years to fade to that particular shade of almost gone. He wore a revolver at his hip, not holstered carelessly the way working men sometimes carried firearms as an afterthought. Holstered deliberately, the way men wore guns when guns were not an accessory, but a profession. He stepped off the train. He scanned the platform once a single sweep that took in every person standing there with a trained efficiency that made Amelia's skin rise, and then his gaze stopped. On her. He walked toward her. The crowd parted without being asked. Amelia stood her ground. "Mrs. Hartwell." His voice was lower than she expected. Not rough, exactly controlled, was closer. The voice of a man who had learned to make himself heard without raising his volume. She answered before she could calculate whether she should. "You are not Thomas Reed." Silence dropped over the platform like a blanket. The man stopped 2 feet in front of her. He removed his hat. His eyes were gray. Not the soft gray of winter sky, but the flat mineral gray of riverstone, a color that gave nothing away and seemed designed specifically for the purpose of giving nothing away. "No, ma'am," he said. She heard someone in the crowd whisper. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the stranger. "My name is Ethan Blackwood." The name meant nothing to her. She would learn later that it should have. "Then where is Thomas Reed?" Something moved across his face. Not grief exactly. She was not sure this man permitted himself grief in public, but the shadow of it. The place where grief had been recently and hadn't entirely left. "Thomas didn't make it," he said. "He passed 3 days ago. Fever. It came on fast." 3 words. Didn't make it. Amelia had spent 4 months building a future on a foundation of letters and careful plans and one blue dress and the quiet hope. The hope she would never have admitted out loud that Thomas Reed's "I will try to be the man you need" was the beginning of something solid. 3 words, and it was gone. She was aware of the crowd. She was aware of Gerald Morse still standing at the edge of the platform, and she could feel him recalculating. She was aware of Margaret Caulfield's expression shifting from curiosity to something uncomfortably close to satisfaction. She was aware of her own hands, which had tightened at her sides, and the particular ache behind her sternum that meant she was very close to something she had not permitted herself in 3 years. She did not allow it now either. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, because Thomas Reed had been a real person and deserved to be acknowledged as one regardless of what his death meant for her. "How did you know him?" "He saved my life," Ethan Blackwood said. "About 4 years back, I owed him. And before he died, he asked me to come here." Amelia looked at him. Really looked the way she looked at horses she wasn't sure of, trying to read the truth beneath the surface. "He asked you to come to Millhaven. He asked me to protect your ranch." The words landed in the silence of the platform. She looked at the gun at his hip. She looked at the scar. She looked at the gray eyes that told her exactly nothing. "Protect it," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "By doing what exactly?" The ghost of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite something else. "Whatever needs doing." And that was the moment that Amelia Hartwell, who had not cried in 3 years and did not intend to start now, felt the full weight of everything that had been taken from her in the span of 4 minutes, and she said what she felt with the directness her father had taught her, and the fury that 3 years of being underestimated had built inside her like a second skeleton. "I waited months," she said. Her voice did not shake. She would not let it shake. "I wrote letters. I planned. I made a legal arrangement with a man who promised to stand beside me and help me protect what is mine. And you with your gun and your scar and your whatever needs doing, you are standing in front of me telling me that all of that is gone." "Thomas is gone," Ethan said quietly. "The offer isn't." "The offer?" She nearly laughed. "You are not a rancher." "No. You are not the man I agreed to marry." "No. You are a gunslinger." He didn't deny it. "I wanted a husband." The words came out harder than she intended, ringing across the platform, and she watched people flinch and did not care. "Not a gunslinger." The crowd was absolutely still. She had expected him to react. Every man she had ever confronted had reacted with dismissal, with condescension, with that particular quiet fury that men used when they wanted to punish you for making them uncomfortable. She had been prepared for all of it. Ethan Blackwood said nothing. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her with those flat gray eyes and simply waited, which was somehow worse than any reaction she had anticipated. After a moment, he spoke. "I know." 2 words. "And I know you have every reason in the world not to trust me." She stared at him. "But Thomas Reed asked me to come here with his last breath," he continued. "And I don't break promises to dying men." Amelia hated those words. Not because they were manipulative. She had enough experience with manipulation to recognize it, and this wasn't it. She hated them because they were exactly the kind of words that a person with her particular values could not easily dismiss. She believed in keeping promises. She believed in honoring the dead. She believed that a person's word was the only currency that couldn't be inflated or foreclosed upon. And this man, this dangerous, scarred, entirely unwanted stranger, was standing in front of her, invoking every principle she held. "You have nowhere else to go," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a test. He held her gaze. "I have plenty of places to go," he said. "I chose to come here." Behind her, she heard Gerald Morse clear his throat and say something quiet to his companion. She did not turn around. She did not give him the satisfaction of watching her struggle. She looked at Ethan Blackwood for a long moment. Then she said, "You sleep in the bunkhouse." He nodded once. "You follow my rules on this property." "Yes, ma'am." "And you do not make decisions about my ranch without consulting me first." "Understood." She turned and walked off the platform. She heard him fall into step behind her, 3 paces back, close enough to follow, far enough to make clear he wasn't presuming, and something about that particular distance told her more than his words had. She didn't trust him, but she filed the distance away. A man who calculated his space the right way at least understood that space mattered. Yeah. The ride back to the ranch was 17 minutes by wagon, and they covered it without speaking. Amelia drove. She always drove her own wagon. There had been a period early in her solo years when men in town had offered to drive it for her, always with an air of helpfulness that barely concealed the assumption that she needed the help, and she had declined every time with a politeness that had gradually sharpened into something less than polite. Ethan Blackwood sat on the seat beside her and watched the landscape and said nothing. She noted that he did not try to take the reins. She noted that she noted it. When they arrived at the ranch and she brought the wagon to a stop near the main gate, her head ranch hand, a 40-year-old man named Clancy, who had worked for her father and stayed on out of loyalty or stubbornness or some combination that she had never fully understood, came out of the barn and stopped dead when he saw the stranger beside her. "Mrs. Hartwell, Clancy." She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for assistance. "This is Ethan Blackwood. He'll be staying in the bunkhouse. Give him a bunk in the far corner." Clancy looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. The look that passed between them was the particular wordless communication of men who had both spent time in places where you learned to read other men quickly and accurately. Something shifted in Clancy's expression. Not warmth, not welcome, but a recalibration of his initial alarm. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Amelia walked toward the house. She made it through the front door. She made it to the kitchen. She sat down at the table that had been her father's table and her grandfather's table before that, and she placed her hands flat on the worn wood surface, and for exactly 43 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the morning. Thomas Reed was dead. Her plan was gone. The bank deadline was in 6 weeks, and the only person standing between her and losing everything was a man she didn't know, with a past she didn't know, carrying a gun she had not asked for. Then she stood up. She put on her work boots. And she went back outside. The first real test came on the 3rd day. She had almost expected it. 2 men arrived on horseback, not cowboys, not settlers, but the particular type of man who appeared on the frontier whenever money changed hands in ways that required muscle to enforce. They wore good clothes and bad expressions, and they asked to speak with the man of the property. Amelia told them there was no such designation on her land. The taller of the two, a man with a wide, flat face, and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never had a door closed on him, looked past her shoulder and said, "Maybe the gentleman inside could help us more." "I am all the help you'll find here," Amelia said. "What's your business?" They were collecting signatures for a water rights petition being organized by a man named Victor Langley, who had recently acquired the property to the east of hers and was, according to the petition's language, working to formalize community access to shared watershed resources, which was legal language for taking water access from smaller ranches and consolidating it under Langley's ownership. She told them she was not signing. The taller man smiled. The kind of smile that meant the conversation wasn't over. Mr. Langley was hoping you might reconsider, he said. He's a generous man to his neighbors. I'm sure he is. He can make things very comfortable for folks who work with him. And very uncomfortable for folks who don't, Amelia said. Yes, I understood the implication. Now I'll ask you to leave my property. The taller man's smile faded slightly. He glanced at his companion. He looked back at Amelia, and she saw him making the calculation that men like him always made when they encountered a woman alone. The calculation about whether the threat was real, whether she had backup, whether she was bluffing about knowing exactly what she was refusing. He had almost completed the calculation when Ethan Blackwood walked out of the barn. He didn't say anything. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply walked out of the barn and stood there about 15 feet away and looked at the two men on horseback with the flat, patient gray eyes that apparently communicated something very specific to men who understood the language. The taller man looked at Ethan. The calculation changed. "We'll let Mr. Langley know you need more time to think it over," he said. "You can let Mr. Langley know I've given him my answer," Amelia said. The men rode away. Amelia did not turn toward Ethan immediately. She waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded. Then she turned. He was already walking back toward the barn. "Blackwood." He stopped. "Did I ask for your help?" He turned halfway. "No, ma'am." "Then why did you come out?" A pause. "Because I wanted to check on the horses." She looked at him. He looked back. She wasn't certain whether it was a lie or not. She decided it didn't matter. "Next time you want to check on the horses," she said, "do it in a way that doesn't make it look like I need a man to stand behind me." Something shifted in his expression. Not defensiveness. Something closer to respect. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll keep that in mind." He went back into the barn. Amelia turned and went back to work. She told herself she wasn't thinking about the way he had positioned himself far enough to look incidental close enough to matter. The precise geometry of it. The way he had managed to be present without being presumptuous. She told herself she wasn't thinking about it. That evening she found him outside the bunkhouse. He was sitting on the step with the revolver broken open, cleaning it with the methodical focus of a man for whom this was ritual rather than maintenance. She stopped. He looked up. "My father was in the war," she said without entirely knowing why she was saying it. "He came back, and he never kept a gun in the house. He said some things shouldn't be brought inside." Ethan looked at the revolver in his hands. "I'll keep it outside," he said. "It's not a demand." "I know. It's just—" She stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Noted," he said simply. And he set the revolver on the step beside him, clearly deliberately, and turned his hands palm up on his knees. She stood there for a moment longer than she intended. "Clancy says you fixed the north fence today. It needed fixing. You could have waited for one of the hands. They had other things to do." She studied him. "You're not what I expected." He seemed to consider that. "What did you expect?" "Trouble," she said honestly. He nodded slowly, as if this was a fair answer. "I've been that before," he said. "I'm trying not to be anymore." She didn't respond to that. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. "The hands eat at 6, she said. "If you haven't eaten, there's food. I appreciate it." She turned to go. "Mrs. Hartwell." She stopped but didn't turn. "I know this isn't what you planned," he said. "I know I'm not who you were waiting for. And I know that every person in that town is watching to see if you made a mistake." She said nothing. "I don't know if I can fix any of that," he continued. "But I know how to keep a ranch safe. And I know how to keep a promise. And right now, those are the only two things I have to offer." She stood with her back to him for a long moment. "That'll have to do," she said. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table again. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had written, "I will try to be the man you need," and about a dying man who had sent the most unlikely replacement she could have imagined. She thought about the way Ethan Blackwood had positioned himself in the yard, present, but not dominant, visible, but not controlling. She thought about the revolver on the step placed there without argument when she'd said one sentence about her father. She thought about a man who had been called dangerous for so long that perhaps he'd stopped questioning whether it was true. She thought about all of these things. And then she put them away and went to bed and told herself she still wasn't crying. She wasn't. But she was closer than she'd been in 3 years. By the end of the second week, the ranch had quietly reorganized itself around the presence of Ethan Blackwood in a way that no one acknowledged out loud, but everyone could feel. Clancy, who had initially watched the stranger with the careful wariness of a man who had seen enough of the frontier to know that dangerous-looking men usually confirmed their appearances, eventually had, by the 6th day, shifted into a different mode. Not trust exactly, but a kind of provisional coexistence that on Clancy was the equivalent of a warm welcome. The other hands followed his lead, the way people follow currents, without deciding to, without discussing it. Ethan worked. This was the thing that nobody quite knew what to do with. He didn't supervise. He didn't manage. He simply picked up whatever needed doing and did it with the efficiency of a man who had learned early that idleness was more dangerous than labor. He repaired the north fence. He rehung the barn door that had been sticking since November. He spent 2 hours with the oldest of the cattle horses, a gray mare named Duchess, who had developed a hitch in her left foreleg that Amelia had been meaning to address, but hadn't had the time or the hands to manage properly. And by the time he was done, the mare was moving smoothly and regarding Ethan with the particular brand of animal trust that Amelia had observed over years of working with horses, the look that meant you are safe. She stood at the fence and watched the mare lean into Ethan's hand. She didn't say anything, but she stayed at the fence longer than she needed to. It was Clancy who told her what he'd learned. 10 days in, after the evening meal, Clancy appeared at her kitchen door with his hat in his hands, which was how Clancy signaled that he had information he thought she needed to have. She poured him coffee and waited. "I asked around about Blackwood," he said. "And he's known in about 6 territories." Clancy wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Not known good either, or not known only good?" "Tell me." "He rode for hire for about 8 years, started young, 16, maybe 17. Man called Decker took him on as a courier first, then as a fixer. Decker was the kind of man who had problems that needed to be fixed in ways that couldn't be written down." Amelia was quiet. 3 years ago something changed," Clancy said. "Story I heard was that Decker told him to burn out a family on a homestead claim there was a land dispute, and Decker wanted it resolved fast and rough. Blackwood refused. Decker came after him." He paused. "Decker didn't come out of that particular dispute." She absorbed this. "Where does Thomas Reed fit in?" "About a year before that. Reed found Blackwood after a bad job went worse. Blackwood was in rough shape alone, no one willing to help him on account of who he worked for. Reed took him in for a month, got him back on his feet. No strings. Thomas Reed helped a hired gun. Thomas Reed helped a person who needed help." Clancy said with the matter-of-fact directness that she had always appreciated about him. "That's what people who knew him say." She was quiet for a moment. "You believe it?" Clancy considered. "I believe a man who spent 3 months fixing fences and gentling horses, and not once trying to tell anyone how to run anything, that man is trying to be different from what he was." "Trying isn't being," she said. "No," Clancy agreed. "But it's the starting place." He finished his coffee and left. Amelia sat alone in her kitchen. She thought about a man who had refused to burn out a family. She thought about a man who had been taken in by Thomas Reed and arrived here carrying Thomas Reed's dying request, and had in 10 days fixed her fence, hung her door, and healed her horse. She thought about trying. She thought about starting places, and she began quietly, and against her own considerable resistance, to reconsider whether the man sleeping in her bunkhouse was the problem she'd assumed he was, or whether he might, in ways she hadn't yet fully understood, be something else entirely. The letter arrived on the 14th day. It came from the bank from Gerald Morse's office, and it was written in the careful, legalistic language of a man who wanted to cause maximum damage while remaining technically within the bounds of propriety. The letter informed her that in the absence of a verified legal partnership or marriage recorded with the territorial office, the bank would be proceeding with its review of her outstanding loan terms. It mentioned with exquisite casualness that recent developments in her personal situation had raised questions about the stability of the property's management. It gave her 30 days to provide documentation of a legal partnership or face accelerated repayment of the outstanding loan balance in full. Amelia read the letter twice. Then she sat very still and understood with the cold clarity that always arrived when she needed it that Gerald Morse had been watching the platform that morning. He had seen a stranger step off the train. He had done his research, and now he was using what he'd found. She folded the letter. She picked up her coat. She went to find Ethan Blackwood. He was in the barn. Of course he was in the barn. He seemed to spend more time with the animals than with people, which she was beginning to understand was a preference rather than an obligation. He looked up when she came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. He handed it back. "Morse," he said. "You know him. Know of him. Men like that don't take no for an answer." He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" She noted the question. "What do you want to do?" Not "here's what we should do." Not "let me handle this." "I want to protect my land," she said. "I want to not give Morse or Langley or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing me fail." "Then you need a legal arrangement," Ethan said. "Something on paper that satisfies the bank's requirements." She looked at him steadily. "Thomas was supposed to provide that." "I know. You are not Thomas. I know that too. But you are here." She paused. "And the deadline doesn't care about any of that." Ethan stood very still. She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for anything beyond what Thomas agreed to," she said. "Legal protection of the deed. Nothing more. Nothing you can't walk away from when this is resolved." Something passed through his gray eyes. Something complicated that she couldn't entirely read. "You'd put your name on a document with mine," he said slowly. "Knowing what Clancy's been finding out about my past." "I'm not marrying your past," she said. "I'm dealing with a bank deadline." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "If we do this, I want it understood between us. Your land stays yours. Your decisions stay yours. I won't use any legal standing to override anything you decide." She had not expected that. She had expected negotiation, terms in his favor, the natural assumption of authority that seemed to come built in with the men she'd dealt with her whole life. She had not expected him to unprompted carve out and hand back every piece of power before she even had to fight for it. She studied his face. "Why?" she asked. "Because Thomas asked me to protect your ranch," Ethan said, "not take it." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll have the paperwork drawn up tomorrow." She turned and walked out of the barn. Outside in the cold April air, she stopped for a moment. She thought about a dying man who had sent her instead of the husband she wanted, a man who led with the words, "Your decisions stay yours." She thought about what it meant that in her experience of the world, that particular sentence was unusual enough to stop her where she stood. She breathed the cold air. She went inside. She did not allow herself to call it hope. But she didn't call it something else either. And in the quiet of the kitchen, with 30 days on the clock, and a gunslinger in her barn who had handed back her authority before she'd asked for it, Amelia Hartwell allowed herself for just one moment to believe that perhaps Thomas Reed in his last days had known something she didn't. Perhaps in the end, the man she hadn't wanted was exactly the one she'd needed. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but she stopped arguing with the possibility. And that, for Amelia Hartwell, was as close to surrender as she had ever come. The paperwork was drawn up on a Thursday. Amelia rode into town herself alone, the way she did everything without asking permission and without announcing her intentions. She went to the office of Henry Pratt, the territorial notary, who was a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers, and the professional discretion of someone who had witnessed enough frontier arrangements to understand that not every legal document told a simple story. She laid out what she needed. Pratt looked at the name she had written on the form. Ethan Blackwood. He said in a tone that was not quite a question. "That's correct." Pratt looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Mrs. Hartwell." "Mr. Pratt," she said quietly. "I have been a client of this office for 3 years. I have always paid promptly and dealt honestly. I am asking you to do your job." A pause. "Yes, ma'am," Pratt said. He drew up the paperwork. She rode back to the ranch with the documents folded inside her coat, pressed against her chest, and she told herself the only thing she felt was the practical relief of having taken a necessary step. She told herself that very firmly for the entire 17-minute ride home. And by the time she arrived, she almost believed it. Ethan was waiting near the gate, not in the way of a man who had been watching for her more, in the way of a man who had been working near the gate and happened to be there when she arrived. She had learned in the past 2 weeks to tell the difference. He was not a man who watched for things. He was a man who positioned himself near things that might need attention. She handed him the documents without preamble. He read them carefully. She noticed that he read everything carefully, not slowly, but with a focused deliberateness that suggested he never moved his eyes over words he didn't intend to understand. He looked up. "You left a line blank," he said. She knew which line. "I know." The line asked for the nature of the legal arrangement. She had left it blank because she had not yet decided what to write there, and she was not a woman who signed things she hadn't decided. "Fill it in however is most useful to you," Ethan said. He handed the documents back. "Whatever gives you the most protection." She looked at him. "You understand what that might mean?" "Yes." "You understand that once this is filed, Gerald Morse will hear about it within 24 hours, and whatever your reputation is in this territory, it will be attached to my name." "I understand." "And you're not concerned about that." Something moved across his face. Not amusement exactly, but the shadow of it. "Mrs. Hartwell, my reputation isn't what I'm trying to protect." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took the documents inside, sat at her father's table, and filled in the blank line. She filed them the next morning. Gerald Morse found out in 18 hours. He came to the ranch himself. This surprised her. Men like Morse usually sent intermediaries. It was safer that way, allowed for deniability, kept their hands clean of the consequences of their own designs. The fact that he came in person told her something she filed away immediately. He was rattled. She met him at the front porch. He was dressed in his banker's coat, which he wore the way some men wore armor, and his expression was the particular blend of cordiality and menace that she had grown thoroughly familiar with over 3 years of fighting him for the right to exist on her own land. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I heard you filed some paperwork yesterday." "I file paperwork regularly, Mr. Morse. It's how business works." "Yes." His gaze moved past her shoulder, and she knew without turning that Ethan had come out of the barn. "I also heard who you filed it with." She said nothing. Morse brought his eyes back to her. "I want to be direct with you, Amelia." "Mrs. Hartwell." He paused. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm trying to help you." "You are trying to acquire my land," she said. "You've been trying to do it for 3 years by making my life as difficult as legally possible. I don't need your directness, Mr. Morse. I need you off my property." His cordiality dropped a fraction. Just a fraction. He was too practiced to lose it entirely in front of witnesses. "The man you've attached your name to has a history that the bank cannot ignore. If there are legal questions about his background—" "There are no legal questions," Amelia said. "Ethan Blackwood has no outstanding warrants in this territory." I checked. She had checked. 2 days ago, she had ridden to the sheriff's office and asked directly, and the sheriff, a weathered man named Aldous Cole, who had known her father, had confirmed it with a look that suggested he found the question interesting. Morse absorbed this. A clean record in this territory doesn't account for Mr. Morse. Her voice dropped, which was the thing she had learned her father did when he was done being patient. Not louder, quieter. The documents are filed. The bank's condition has been met. If you have a legal objection, put it in writing and send it to my notary. Otherwise, we have nothing further to discuss. Behind her, she heard boots on the porch steps. Ethan stopped beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. It was a small distinction that Morse noticed immediately, and she saw his calculation shift again. The same recalculation she had watched happen in the yard with his hired men, a rapid reassessment of the landscape. Morse looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back. Blackwood, Morse said with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his tone deliberately. I've heard of you. Most people have, Ethan said. His voice was perfectly even. Doesn't tell you much about who I am now. Morse's jaw tightened. The bank will be watching this arrangement very closely. Banks usually do, Ethan said. That's what makes a good one. Course, a good bank also knows when a loan is being serviced on time and the terms are being met, and there's no legitimate cause for concern. A pause. Is there a legitimate cause for concern, Mr. Morse? The silence stretched. Morse looked at Amelia. Amelia looked back at him with the expression she had perfected over 3 years of these encounters, the expression that said she was not afraid of him, she had never been afraid of him, and she did not intend to start. Good day, Mrs. Hartwell, Morse said. He rode out. Amelia watched him go. Then she said without turning, I told you not to make it look like I need a man standing beside me. You're right, Ethan said. I'm sorry, He stopped. You handled it. I should have stayed in the barn. She turned and looked at him. He was genuinely contrite, not performing contrition, actually bothered by having overstepped in the way of a man who took the rules he agreed to seriously. Next time, she said, stay in the barn. Yes, ma'am. She went inside. She stood in her kitchen and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed, and she realized that the anger she had expected to feel about him stepping out was smaller than the thing she felt about the beside her. Not in front. Beside. She pressed that observation flat and put it away. She had work to do. The town's reaction came in waves. The first wave was gossip, which was inevitable, and which Amelia had anticipated. She heard it secondhand through Clancy, who heard it at the feed store the widow Hartwell had taken on a hired gun. The widow Hartwell had filed legal papers with a man of dangerous reputation. The widow Hartwell had lost her mind, or her options, or both. She let it wash over her. The second wave was more specific. Margaret Caulfield appeared at the ranch on the 5th day after the filing, ostensibly to return a pie dish that had been lent 3 months ago and apparently forgotten until this particular moment required a social call. She stood in Amelia's kitchen with the empty dish and her most concerned expression and said, I just want to make sure you know what people are saying. I know exactly what people are saying, Amelia said. Would you like coffee? People are saying he's a dangerous man. People said my father was a reckless man because he refused to sell his water rights when the railroad wanted them. She poured 2 cups. My father died with his water rights. Margaret took the cup. This is different. How? Because a dangerous man is. Margaret searched for the right word. Unpredictable. Amelia looked at her steadily. In 2 weeks, Ethan Blackwood has fixed my north fence, rehung the barn door that was sticking since November, gotten Duchess moving right again, and repaired the well housing that Clancy and the boys have been working around for 2 months. He has not raised his voice, touched anything that wasn't his, or made a single decision on this property without my approval. She set down her cup. Tell me, Margaret, is that more or less predictable than most men you know? Margaret opened her mouth. Margaret closed her mouth. She finished her coffee and left shortly after. The third wave came from a direction Amelia hadn't fully anticipated. It came from inside her own chest. Say, it started small. She noticed things. The way he left the gun outside every single night without being reminded, without making a point of it. The way he listened when Clancy and the hands talked at dinner, actually listened, not the kind of half-attention that passed for listening when men were waiting for their own turn to speak. The way he was with the animals, the horses especially, but also the cattle dogs, and even a particular half-wild cat that had been living in the barn rafters for 2 years and had never permitted human contact before somehow deciding that Ethan Blackwood was an acceptable exception. She noticed the way he never not once walked into her house without being invited. She noticed the way he asked questions. Specific, intelligent questions about the ranch's water systems, about her agreements with neighboring properties, about the history of the land dispute with Langley. Questions that told her he was paying attention to the whole picture, not just the immediate visible problem. She noticed that when young Danny Park, her youngest hand, made a serious miscalculation with a cattle gate and let 6 head loose into the north pasture, requiring 2 hours of hard work to correct, Ethan's response to the boy was, "Happened to me worse than that. You know now what you didn't know before. That's the whole point." Danny had looked at him like he'd been handed something he didn't know how to hold. Amelia had watched from across the yard and felt something tighten in her throat that she declined to examine. The noticing accumulated, and one evening, without planning to, she sat down beside him on the porch step. He looked mildly surprised. She looked out toward the tree line. "Thomas wrote to me about the Montana winters," she said. "He said he'd never gotten used to them even after 10 years. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He never stopped talking about getting somewhere warmer," he said. He had it in his head that he'd eventually land somewhere that didn't try to freeze him to death 6 months out of 12. He almost made it. He almost made it. A pause. "He was glad you wrote back to him. He told me that. Said he'd half expected a woman in your situation to be harder than she came across in letters." Amelia looked at the darkening sky. "And what did he say I came across as?" "Honest," Ethan said. "Smart. The kind of woman who meant what she said and expected other people to as well." She sat with that for a moment. "What else did he tell you about me?" she asked. "That you'd probably try to send me away," Ethan said. There was the ghost of warmth in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as what passed for humor with him. "And that I should be patient." "He told you to be patient with me." "He said—" Ethan stopped, seemed to be deciding something. Then, "He said you'd spent 3 years carrying more than anyone should have to carry alone, and that if I gave you half a reason to trust me, you were the kind of woman who would honor that. And if I gave you no reason, you were the kind of woman who'd be right to run me off." Amelia looked at her hands. Thomas Reed had known her from 4 months of letters, and apparently he had known her well enough to brief the dangerous stranger he was sending in his place. "He was a good man," she said. "The best I've ever known," Ethan said, simply, without performance. She stood up. "Good night, Blackwood." "Good night, Mrs. Hartwell." She went inside. She stood in her kitchen and did not allow herself to think about the fact that the most honest conversation she had with another person in 3 years had just taken place on her porch steps, with a man whose name had made a banker flinch. She put on the kettle. She thought about Thomas Reed saying the kind of woman who would honor that. She thought he wasn't wrong. 3 weeks after Ethan's arrival, Victor Langley came to town. She heard about it from Clancy, who had heard about it at the post office, which was the nerve center of Millhaven's intelligence network. Langley had arrived with 2 associates and taken rooms at the hotel, and had spent his first afternoon in what the post office clerk described as a long conversation with Mr. Morse at the bank. Amelia heard this and understood it immediately. She went to find Ethan. He was in the barn. He was always in the barn when she needed to find him quickly, which she was beginning to think was either convenient or deliberate. "Langley's here," she said. Ethan looked up. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The particular alertness of a man who processed threat assessments automatically and couldn't quite turn the reflex off. "How long?" "Arrived this afternoon." "Did he come to the ranch?" "Not yet." She paused. He will. Ethan set down the brush he'd been using on the mare's flank. Tell me what you know about him. She did. She told him everything. The water rights petition, the previous offers to buy her out. The 2 conversations she'd had with his representatives, the way the pressure had escalated incrementally over 18 months, in a pattern that was too consistent to be coincidental. She told him about the East Pasture, which contained the primary water access for 3 other properties, and what it would mean for those properties if Langley got control of it. She told him about the families on those properties, the Garcias who had 3 children, and had been on their land for 11 years, and old May Sutton, who had outlived her husband and her eldest son, and was holding on through sheer stubbornness, and the Park family, whose youngest boy was her ranch hand, Danny. She told him all of it. He listened, all of it, without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He's not just after your water rights." "I know. He wants the whole parcel. The water rights are the leverage he gets control of the water, and he controls what every property downstream can do. Then he offers to buy them out at terms they can't afford to refuse." "I know," she said again. "Have you talked to the other families?" She hesitated. He noticed the hesitation. "They don't know the pattern," she said. "They see it as separate problems. The Garcias think their late payment to the bank is about bad luck. May Sutton thinks the bank's pressure on her is about her being a widow. Danny's family." She stopped. "They don't know it's coordinated," Ethan said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "They need to know. If I go to them and tell them they're all being targeted by the same man operating through the same bank, they'll either panic or they won't believe me." "Or they'll be angry," Ethan said. "And angry people who know the truth are harder to push around than scared people who don't." She looked at him. "Langley's counting on everyone seeing their own problem in isolation," he said. "The moment they see it as one problem with one source, his leverage drops by half." She hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms. She had been so focused on her own land, her own deadline, her own survival, that she hadn't stepped back to see the whole map. "You've seen this before," she said. "Versions of it." He paused. "Men like Langley don't build anything. They acquire. And the way they acquire is by making sure the people they're targeting never compare notes." Amelia stood very still. She was thinking about the Garcias who had been her neighbors for 11 years, and whose eldest daughter had once spent a summer helping her mend fences when she was short-handed. She was thinking about May Sutton, who had brought food to this ranch when her father died without being asked. She was thinking about Danny Park, who made mistakes with cattle gates, and looked at Ethan Blackwood with something close to reverence. "I need to talk to them," she said. "Yes," Ethan said, "and I need evidence. Something concrete. Not just my word against Langley's." "Then we find evidence." The word we landed in the space between them. She noticed it. He noticed that she noticed it. "If you'll let me help," he said with deliberate care. "Your decision. Start with the land records," she said. "The county office keeps transaction filings going back 15 years. If Langley has been systematically buying up debt or acquiring failing properties, there'll be a pattern in the records. I can ride to the county office tomorrow." "We both go," she said. "Two people asking questions is less suspicious than one." He nodded. She turned to leave. "Mrs. Hartwell." She stopped. "The Garcia family, May Sutton, the Parks. They trust you," he said. "Whatever we find, it'll matter more coming from you." She turned halfway. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you might be tempted to send me," he said. "And I shouldn't be the one to do it. Whatever I am to this town, I'm not someone who should be showing up at struggling families' doors with bad news about powerful men." A pause. "That's your relationship to use." "I don't have one." She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said slowly, "is either the most self-aware thing anyone has ever said to me, or you're much better at this than you look." Something that was nearly a smile moved across his face. "Could be both." She went inside. She sat at her father's table. She thought about a man who knew exactly what he was and wasn't in a situation, and offered what he had instead of overreaching for what he didn't. She thought about the word we. She thought about Thomas Reed, who had spent a month getting a stranger back on his feet with no strings attached, and who had sent that same stranger here to protect a woman he'd only met through letters. She thought about what it meant that Thomas had trusted Ethan Blackwood with the most important thing in his life. She began making a list, not the fearful list she had made the night the bank first threatened her. Not the survival list. A different kind of list, names, properties, evidence needed, conversations required. The list of a woman who had stopped fighting alone and was beginning carefully and with clear eyes and without any romantic illusion about what it meant to understand what it felt like to have someone fighting in the same direction. She wrote Ethan's name at the top. She stared at it. She didn't cross it off. Langley came to the ranch on a Friday. She had been expecting, it had felt it coming in the particular way of frontier women who learned to read the weather, not just in the sky, but in the social atmosphere of a town, the slight shifts and pressures that preceded a storm. He came alone, which was either confidence or calculation, or both. Victor Langley was not what she expected. She had built him in her mind as the kind of man who looked the part of a villain, large and loud and obvious. But the man who rode through her gate was of medium height and careful dress, and the pleasant, attentive manner of a man who had learned that being underestimated was the most useful tool available. He smiled at her. She did not smile back. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "I apologize for not calling sooner. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly for some time." "Mr. Langley," she said. "I know who you are." "Then you know I'm a neighbor," he said pleasantly. "And I believe neighbors ought to talk before lawyers do." He dismounted. She noted that he glanced at the barn. "My husband isn't available," she said, because she had decided before he arrived to use the word simply and directly and watch what it did to him. His eyes came back to her. Something brief and recalculating moved through them. "I actually hope to speak with you," he said. "I've been following your situation with the bank, and I want you to know that I find Gerald Morse's pressure tactics." "Spare me," she said. He stopped. "You are coordinating with Gerald Morse," she said in the same tone she would use to discuss the weather. "You have been buying up distressed debt in this county for 18 months. You have made offers through intermediaries on the Garcia property, the Sutton property, and 2 others I've identified. And the water rights petition your men have been circulating is designed to create legal grounds for you to restrict water access to any property that doesn't sell to you." Langley's pleasant expression didn't collapse. That was the thing about men like him. They were practiced at absorbing blows without showing them. But something behind his eyes went very still. "Those are serious allegations," he said. "They're documented facts," she said, "which I will be presenting to the county land office and the territorial sheriff within the next 2 weeks. A pause. "That's ambitious," he said. "For a woman in your position." "My position," she said, "is a woman standing on her own land, which she intends to keep. What's your position?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the barn again. Then he smiled a different smile than before, with none of the pleasantness in it. "You're smarter than Morse thought," he said. "I told him that actually. Good of you. But smart doesn't always win," he said. "Not when the other side has more resources, more time, and more patience." "Then it's a good thing I'm also stubborn," Amelia said. He mounted his horse. At the gate, he paused and looked back. "Your husband," he said. "Tell him I said hello." He rode out. Amelia stood still until the sound of his horse faded. Then her hands, which she had held perfectly steady through the entire exchange, began to shake. She pressed them against her sides. She breathed. She heard the barn door. Ethan came across the yard. He had been inside the barn the whole time she knew it. Langley had known it. Everyone had known it, and he had stayed there. She had not asked him to. He had known. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. "How bad?" he asked. He confirmed everything without saying anything. "That's what I thought." "He's not scared," she said. "He's recalibrating." "Yes." She looked at him. "He's going to come at us harder." "Yes." Ethan said again. She absorbed this. Are you afraid of that? He met her eyes. No. Why not? Because afraid men make bad decisions, he said, and I don't intend to make bad decisions. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of fighting alone. She thought about lists and plans, and the blue dress, and Thomas Reed's letters, and a stranger with gray eyes who had walked off a train and positioned himself beside her, and stayed in the barn when she needed to stand alone, and come out when he thought she might need him, and been wronged by one person and apologized for it. She thought about all of this. Then she said, I'm going to the Garcia place tomorrow. I need to talk to them before Langley does. I'll have the horses ready at 6, Ethan said. 5:30, she said. He almost smiled. She went inside. She did not look back. But for the first time in 3 years, walking toward her father's kitchen table, she did not feel the weight of everything she was carrying pressing down on her alone. It was still heavy. But something had shifted in the distribution of it. Something that had nothing to do with legal documents or bank deadlines or the careful professional arrangement she had told herself this was. And Amelia Hartwell, who was honest above all other things, could no longer quite bring herself to pretend she didn't know what it was. They rode out at 5:30. The air was cold and the horses moved fast, and neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes, which Amelia had come to understand was not awkwardness, but simply how Ethan Blackwood occupied space in the early morning quietly, without demanding conversation, letting the day settle around him before engaging with it. She had initially found this unsettling. She was used to men who filled silence with noise as a way of asserting their presence. Ethan's silence asserted nothing. It simply was. She had started to find it restful. That realization had arrived 3 days ago, and she had not known what to do with it, so she had put it in the same mental drawer as the word we, and the hand that had stayed in the barn, and the particular geometry of beside her, and closed the drawer firmly and gone back to work. The drawer was getting crowded. The Garcia Ranch was 40 minutes east, a modest operation that had survived 11 years through Elena Garcia's stubbornness, and her husband Roberto's skill with cattle, and the kind of accumulated small decisions that kept a frontier property alive, when nothing about the frontier made survival easy. Amelia had known them since her father was alive. She knew their children's names. She knew that Elena kept a kitchen garden that produced the best tomatoes in the county, and that Roberto had once driven 2 days through a blizzard to bring medicine to a sick neighbor because that was simply what you did out here. She knew them, which made what she was about to tell them harder. When they arrived, Elena came out before they had fully dismounted the frontier habit of people who track the sound of approaching horses automatically the way you tracked weather. She looked at Amelia. She looked at Ethan. Her expression asked the question her mouth hadn't formed yet. Elena, Amelia said, I need to talk to you and Roberto about something important. Roberto appeared in the doorway. He was wiping his hands on a cloth, and his expression carried the particular guarded look of a man who had been managing bad news in small installments for long enough to recognize when a larger delivery was coming. They sat at the Garcia kitchen table. Amelia laid it out. She didn't soften it. She had decided on the ride over that softening it would be an insult. These were people who had been managing their own survival long enough to deserve the truth in plain language. So she told them about the pattern she and Ethan had identified in the county land records. She told them about the debt acquisitions, the coordinated bank pressure, the water rights petition, and what it was actually designed to do. She told them that Victor Langley had visited her ranch 2 days ago, and that his tone beneath the pleasantries was the tone of a man who believed he had already won and was simply managing the timeline. Elena and Roberto listened without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Elena said very quietly, The bank called our loan last month. Gerald Morse said it was a routine review. It was not a routine review, Amelia said. Roberto's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan. You said you found this in the county records. Transaction filings going back 18 months, Ethan said. Langley's been buying distressed debt through a holding company called Western Territorial Holdings. The name doesn't appear on any of the direct correspondence, but the filings trace back to him. Can you prove that connection? Roberto asked. We can document it well enough to take to the territorial sheriff, Ethan said. Whether the sheriff acts on it depends on a lot of things, but the documentation exists. Roberto looked at Amelia. What do you need from us? She had been prepared for skepticism, for fear for the protective withdrawal that people sometimes made when a threat was bigger than they wanted to face. She had not been fully prepared for the directness of "what do you need from us" delivered without hesitation. Her throat tightened briefly. I need you to talk to May Sutton, she said. She trusts you more than she trusts me right now. I think she's been told things about my situation that have made her cautious. And I need the same conversation to happen with the Park family. Elena nodded. I'll go to May myself. Today. There's one more thing, Amelia said. Langley knows we're gathering information. I told him as much to his face, which was... She paused. Possibly not the most strategically patient decision I've ever made. Roberto almost smiled. Sounds like you. It means he'll move faster now, Ethan said. Which means we need to move faster too. Roberto looked at Ethan again, the long measuring look of a man who was deciding whether to trust what he was seeing or what he'd heard. People in town have a lot to say about you, he said. I imagine they do, Ethan said. Are any of it worth listening to? Some of it's true, Ethan said. The part about who I used to work for. The part about what that work was. He didn't look away. The part about me being here to protect Amelia Hartwell's ranch because a dying man asked me to, that's also true. Roberto held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. We'll talk to the others, he said. They rode back with the early sun behind them, and Amelia felt something shift in the weight she'd been carrying, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed, spread across more shoulders than just her own. She thought about Elena Garcia saying, I'll go to May myself today, without calculation, without negotiating, simply as a statement of what needed to happen and who would do it. She thought about how alone she had felt for 3 years. She thought about how she had let herself stay that way. You were quiet in there, she said to Ethan without preamble. He glanced at her. You had it. You had information they needed. You had their trust, he said. Information without trust is just noise. You gave them the trust first. I gave them the specifics after. A pause. That's how it should work. She rode in silence for a moment. You're different than I expected, she said. It was the second time she'd said something like that to him, and this time she didn't try to pull it back. You said that before, he said. I know. She looked at the horizon. I keep needing to say it again because I keep being more right about it than I was the last time. He said nothing, but she saw something happen in his face, something brief and unguarded, the expression of a man who had been told something he didn't know how to receive, not because it was bad, but because the receiving of it required space he hadn't made room for yet. She looked away and let him have it. The county records office was located in a building on the main street of the county seat 12 miles from Mill Haven, and it was staffed by a man named Aldous Webb, who had the particular energy of someone who had organized information for so long that he had begun to resemble it, precise, cross-referenced, and almost entirely without small talk. Amelia and Ethan arrived at 10 in the morning and left at 2:30. In those 4.5 hours they built a map. It was not a literal map. It was a structure of transactions and dates and company names and filing numbers that taken individually meant nothing, and taken together described something unmistakable. Ethan worked through the records with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent years in situations where reading documents quickly and accurately meant the difference between seeing what was coming and not seeing it until it arrived. Amelia cross-referenced. She caught 2 connections he'd initially moved past a secondary holding company linked to the first by a shared registered agent and a land transfer from 14 months ago that tied Morse's bank directly to a Langley property acquisition that should not have involved the bank at all. There, she said, pointing at the filing. The bank acted as escrow agent on this transfer. Morse can't claim he didn't know who Langley was or what he was doing. They've been working together at least since then. Ethan studied the document. That's the thread, he said quietly. If the territorial sheriff pulls on that, the whole arrangement unravels. She looked at the stack of documents they had assembled. They had enough. Not everything. There were gaps that a good lawyer could complicate, but enough to make a credible case to a credible authority. Enough to take to the county land office and the territorial sheriff. Enough possibly to take to the territorial newspaper, which had a new editor who had come west from Chicago with the particular zeal of a man who believed that frontier journalism was supposed to mean something. We need copies, she said. I'll have Webb make them. 2 sets, she said. 1 for the sheriff, 1 we keep. 3 sets, Ethan said. 1 we give to someone outside the county. She looked at him. If Langley figures out what we have, the first thing he does is try to get it back, he said. You don't want your only copies of this in a place he can reach. She absorbed this. Who do you trust outside the county? A pause. There's a judge in Cheyenne, Ethan said slowly. A federal judge. His name is Reardon. I did him a service once, helped him get evidence out of a situation that was going badly. He's an honest man. She studied him. A federal judge. Yes. You know a federal judge. I've known a lot of people, he said. Not all of them were the wrong kind. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the strange, complicated life this man had lived that had put him in contact with both hired gunmen and federal judges. And she thought about Thomas Reed finding him in exactly the right moment between those 2 worlds and pulling him toward the better one. Write to Reardon, she said, today. They rode back to Millhaven with copies of the documents in Amelia's saddlebag, and the kind of focused, energized silence between them that came from people who had been working toward the same thing and knew they'd found what they needed. It was a different silence than the early morning silence on the way to the Garcias. That silence had been peaceful. This one had velocity. They were halfway back when Ethan said, "Someone's following us." She didn't turn. How long? Since we left the county seat. Langley's men? Or Morse's. The distinction may not matter much. She kept her pace steady. What do you want to do? Keep riding, he said. Get back to the ranch. Don't let them know we've made them. And if they try to stop us before we get there? He looked at her. They won't. Not on an open road in daylight with witnesses. A pause. They're watching what we have. That's all for now. She absorbed this. You've been followed before, often enough to know the difference between someone watching and someone acting. And when does watching become acting? When they know what you have and decide they'd rather you didn't have it. He glanced at her. Which is why Reardon gets his copies before anything else happens. She nodded. They reached the ranch without incident. But that night, for the first time, Ethan brought the revolver inside. He set it on the table near the door of the bunkhouse. Amelia saw it when she brought dinner across, and she didn't say anything about it. She thought about her father. She thought about some things shouldn't be brought inside. She thought about the fact that it was not her house, and that the bunkhouse was Ethan's space, and that a man who had read every boundary she laid down with the precision of someone who took boundaries seriously had made a different calculation tonight. She left the food and went back to her house. She locked her own door for the first time in 2 years. The twist came from where she least expected it. It always did. It came from Margaret Coalfield of all people, Margaret who had appeared with an empty pie dish and a head full of gossip, and whom Amelia had largely dismissed as a source of anything useful. Margaret appeared at the ranch gate on a Tuesday morning with an expression that was nothing like her usual performance of concerned helpfulness. She looked frightened. Amelia brought her inside. Margaret sat at the kitchen table and held her coffee cup in both hands and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry that I didn't." Amelia sat down across from her and said nothing. She had learned that silence applied at the right moment made people fill it with the thing they actually needed to say. "Gerald Morse came to see me 2 weeks ago," Margaret said. He asked me about you. About your ranch, about the arrangement with Blackwood, about whether the other ranchers trusted you. She looked at the table. He offered me a finder's fee if I kept him informed about what was happening. The kitchen was very quiet. He wanted you to spy on me, Amelia said. He wanted me to keep him informed. Margaret looked up. I told myself it wasn't the same thing. But it is. Yes, Margaret said. It is. She set down her cup. I didn't tell him anything that mattered. I told him you had visitors, and you rode out early sometimes, and your ranch hand trusted the Blackwood man more than he'd expected to. Nothing he couldn't have found out himself. She paused. But I know that's not the point. No, Amelia said. It's not. The point is that he asked me, Margaret said, and I said I'd think about it instead of telling him to go to the devil, which is what your father would have said, and what I should have said. Her voice had the particular unsteadiness of someone who had been carrying something for weeks and finally set it down. Amelia, he's not after just your land. He's trying to isolate you. He went to 2 other people in town. I don't know who. He didn't tell me, and I think he was building a picture of who you were talking to and what you were finding. Amelia's mind moved fast. She thought about the ride back from the county seat, someone following them. Langley already knew they'd been to the records office. Thank you, Margaret, she said. I know that might not— Thank you, Amelia said again. Sincerely, I mean it. Margaret looked at her. Something in her expression shifted the relief of a woman who had expected judgment and received something more complicated and more useful. What are you going to do? What I've been doing, Amelia said. Faster. She waited until Margaret left. Then she went directly to find Ethan. He was at the north fence. She told him everything in 60 seconds. He listened without moving. Then, he knows we went to the records office. Yes. And he's been building surveillance for weeks. Yes. Then he knows about Reardon. She stopped. She hadn't thought of that. She thought of it now and felt cold. The letter hasn't gone out yet, she said. Then it goes out today, Ethan said. Right now. I'll write it myself. To Cheyenne? It's a day and a half. I'll be back in 3. She looked at him. If you leave, Morse and Langley know you're gone? Yes. They'll use that. Probably. Ethan. She stopped. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt it land between them like a stone dropping into still water. He went very still. If you leave right now, and they move on the ranch while you're gone. Clancy's here, he said. Danny and the other hands. Roberto Garcia said he'd come if you sent word. And you— He looked at her directly. You've been doing this alone for 3 years. You don't need me to stand between you and them. You need the evidence to get where it can't be buried. She held his gaze. He was right. She knew he was right. And she knew that he knew she knew it, which meant this was not a conversation about whether he should go. This was a conversation about the fact that she didn't want him to. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he said. 4 at the outside. She nodded. He went to saddle his horse. She stood at the fence and watched him go, and told herself the tightness in her chest was practical concern about the ranch's security in his absence, and she maintained this position for approximately 40 seconds before abandoning it entirely. She missed him before he was through the gate. Day. The first day without him was fine. The second day was harder. Not because anything went wrong. The ranch ran the way it always ran. Clancy managed the hands the way he always managed them. And Roberto Garcia arrived on the second morning with his eldest son and his rifle and the quiet, no-nonsense readiness of a man who had decided that Amelia Hartwell's problem was his problem too, which made something ache behind her sternum in a way that was not unpleasant. But Ethan's absence had a shape. The bunkhouse step where he sat in the evenings was empty. The barn felt different without his particular brand of focused quiet in it. The revolver that he'd placed on the bunkhouse table was gone with him, and she told herself she didn't notice its absence the way she noticed his. But she was an honest woman, and so she admitted to herself that she was wrong. She was in the kitchen on the second evening when Roberto appeared at her door. "Rider coming," he said, "from the direction of town." She went out. The rider was a boy, maybe 15, hired out by the telegram office to run messages to outlying properties. He handed her a folded paper with the formal crease of official correspondence. It was from the bank. It was not Morse's usual style of veiled legal pressure. It was a foreclosure notice, dated that morning, filed with the Territorial Land Office at 9 a.m. She read it twice. Her hands were steady. Roberto was watching her. "Morse filed for foreclosure," she said. Roberto's expression darkened. "On what grounds you've met the payment terms?" "He's citing irregularities in the legal partnership documentation," she said. "He's claiming the arrangement with Ethan doesn't meet the bank's requirements for a verified legal partnership because—" She stopped and read the specific language. Her jaw tightened. "Because Ethan's prior history renders the arrangement potentially fraudulent." "He can't do that," Roberto said. "He's doing it." She folded the notice. "He waited for Ethan to leave. He's been watching the ranch. He knew when he left, and he filed this the same morning." She looked at Roberto. "He's moving faster than I expected." "What do you need?" She was already thinking. "I need to get to the Territorial Land Office before Langley's lawyer does. If I can file a formal contest of the foreclosure, it puts a temporary hold on proceedings while the grounds are reviewed." "That's a 60-mile ride," Roberto said. "I know." "Amelia." "I've ridden longer," she said. "In worse weather." She was saddling her horse when she heard the sound of a rider coming hard from the north, fast enough to mean something urgent, and her hands paused on the cinch, and she turned. It was Ethan. He came through the gate at a speed that told her something had happened before he'd had time to tell her, and he pulled up beside her and took one look at her face and the folded notice in her hand and said, "He filed." "This morning," she said. "How did you—" "I got to the first night's stop and found a telegram waiting." He swung down. His horse was hard-ridden and breathing heavy. "Reardon." He'd already heard apparently Langley has contacts in Cheyenne who got wind of the letter somehow. "Reardon sent word back to meet me on the road." She stared at him. Reardon already knew. "Reardon has been watching Langley for 8 months, Ethan said. "We're not the only people who figured out the pattern. We're just the ones with the local records that complete the picture he's already been building." The world rearranged itself in her understanding. "He wants the documents," she said. "He wants copies," Ethan said. "And he wants testimony. From you. From the Garcia family and May Sutton and the Parks if they're willing. A federal judge is building a case against Langley." "Against Langley and Morse," Ethan said. "Both. Together. The land fraud and the bank collusion. Reardon's jurisdiction covers both." She looked at him. He was watching her with those flat gray eyes, and she could see in them the thing he was not saying, that this changed everything, that the ground under their feet had shifted, that what had felt like a desperate rearguard action against a powerful man was suddenly part of something larger and more powerful than either of them had known. "You rode back?" she said. "You're more important than the letter," he said, simply, without drama. The way he said most things that turned out to matter most. Something broke open in her chest. Not dramatically. Not the way she'd feared it would, not like losing control. Not like vulnerability. Not like weakness. More like the way a fist unclenches after it's been closed so long that you forgot it was a fist. She looked at him. He looked at her. Roberto Garcia, who had the social intelligence of a man who had been married for 17 years to a formidable woman, quietly moved away and found something to do on the other side of the yard. "The foreclosure notice," she said. "I need to contest it at the land office." "We go tomorrow," Ethan said. "Tonight we make copies of everything we have. 2 sets, one for the land office, one for Reardon. He'll have his people there. He said to send word when we're ready. He'll move quickly." She nodded. She looked at the foreclosure notice in her hand. She thought about Gerald Morse sitting in his bank this morning, watching the clock and filing paperwork designed to take her land, while the man who stood beside her was out of reach. She thought about how badly that calculation was about to fail. "Tonight," she said. "Every document, organized and copied." "I'll start now," Ethan said. She turned toward the house. "Amelia." She stopped. He hadn't used her name before. Not once in the weeks he'd been here. Always Mrs. Hartwell, respectful, careful, maintaining every line she'd drawn. He'd used it now. She turned. He looked at her from across the yard with the late sun behind him and the horse still breathing hard beside him, and he said, "I'm glad I came back." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. She went inside. She put on the kettle and laid out the documents and began organizing them with the focused efficiency of a woman who had made her decision and was done second-guessing it, and the decision was not about land records or bank filings or federal judges. It was about a man who had ridden back through the night because she mattered more than the letter. It was about the fact that she had told herself this was a practical arrangement and had believed it carefully and with considerable effort for exactly 26 days. And it was about the moment on the porch step when he'd said the best I've ever known about Thomas Reed, simply and without performance. And she had known then what she was dealing with even if she hadn't been ready to name it. She named it now, quietly, to herself. At her father's table with the documents spread around her and the kettle coming to heat. She was not afraid of it. She was, if she was honest, more afraid of what it meant about how close she'd come to sending him away. She thought about Thomas Reed. She thought about a dying man's last breath spent on a promise. She thought he knew. She thought somehow he knew. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Ethan at the bunkhouse table, already working through documents by lamplight, steady and focused, and entirely present, the way he was with everything that mattered. She turned back to her own work. They had a case to build. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not building it alone. They worked through the night, not side by side at the same table, Ethan at the bunkhouse, Amelia at the kitchen, but in a rhythm that felt coordinated anyway, the kind of parallel effort that develops between people who have been paying close enough attention to each other that they no longer need to negotiate the small things. Every hour or so, one of them would cross the yard with a document that cross-referenced something the other was working on, a question about a filing date, a correction to a company name. They would exchange what they had, stand together for a few minutes going over it, and then go back to their separate tables. Clancy stayed up too. He didn't say why. He just appeared in the barn doorway around 10 o'clock, with his coat on, and his rifle leaned against the post beside him, and his expression making clear that he had decided this was a night to keep watch, and nobody was going to talk him out of it. Roberto Garcia had ridden home at sunset, but sent word back with his eldest son, who arrived just after dark. "We'll be at the land office. Tell us when." By 2 in the morning, they had 3 complete sets of documents. By 3, everything was organized, labeled, and ready. Amelia sat back in her chair and looked at what they had built, and for a moment, she simply allowed herself to feel the weight of it. Not the fear, not the pressure, but the sheer accumulated effort of 30 days of fighting on every front simultaneously, and the extraordinary fact that she was sitting here with something that might actually win. She heard boots on the porch. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I'll sleep on the ride." He leaned against the doorframe. 2 hours. At least lie down. She looked at him. He had that look, the one she had come to recognize as his version of caring about something which was almost identical to his regular expression, except for a particular quality of attention in his eyes, a focus that was different from his professional watchfulness, more specific and somehow more careful. "Ethan," she said. "Yes. When this is over—" She stopped. She hadn't planned to say this now at 3 in the morning with ink on her fingers and the most important day of her fight still ahead of her. But she was an honest woman, and honest women said what was true when it was true, not when it was convenient. When this is over, I don't want you to leave." The room was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through those gray eyes, the complicated passage of a man processing something he wanted very much and had decided he wasn't allowed to want. "I came here to keep a promise," he said carefully. "I know why you came," she said. "I'm telling you why I want you to stay." He said nothing. "You don't have to answer that now," she said. "Go keep watch. I'll sleep 2 hours." She stood and went to the back room. She lay down without changing her clothes. She slept in 4 minutes, which was a record even for her, and she did not examine what that said about how much the tension in her chest had released. They rode out at first light. Amelia, Ethan Clancy, and Roberto's son Miguel, who had his father's steady disposition and his mother's eyes, and who had appointed himself their informal outrider without being asked. The Territorial Land Office was 60 miles east, which was a long, hard ride, and they covered the first 20 in near silence, with everyone doing the internal calculation of what the day required and what it might cost. The document satchel was in Amelia's saddlebag. Ethan rode slightly ahead, which she allowed now without comment. She had made her peace with the distinction between someone riding ahead to clear the path and someone riding ahead to lead. He was doing the former. She had stopped needing to announce that she understood the difference. They were 30 miles out when they hit trouble. 2 riders on the road ahead stopped, waiting. Not Langley's hired men, she recognized both of them. One was a deputy from the county sheriff's office named Tate, who had always been in Morse's pocket, and the other was a man she didn't know, but whose bearing confirmed what Tate's presence suggested. Tate raised his hand. "Mrs. Hartwell, we need you to come with us." She kept riding. She stopped her horse 10 feet from him. "On what authority?" Tate produced a paper. "Court order. Filed this morning by Mr. Gerald Morse. There are questions about fraudulent documentation in the legal partnership you filed last month." The word fraudulent landed like a physical thing. Ethan had pulled up beside her. She felt him go very still. "That order was filed this morning," she said. "The land office opens at 8. We are riding to contest the foreclosure notice that was filed yesterday. The timing of this court order is not a coincidence. Ma'am, You are carrying a paper that was filed in the last 12 hours on the same day I am scheduled to file a formal contest by the man whose fraudulent practices are documented in my saddlebag." She looked at Tate steadily. "I am going to ride to the land office and file my contest. If Gerald Morse has a legitimate legal action, he can pursue it after I have exercised my right to contest his foreclosure. That is the law." Tate hesitated. The other man started to move his horse forward. Ethan moved his horse 2 steps left. Not threatening, not reaching for anything, simply repositioning so that he was between the other man's horse and Amelia's, and his posture communicated something very clearly to someone who could read it. The other man's horse stopped. "Deputy Tate," Ethan said in the quiet, controlled voice that Amelia had come to understand meant he was being extremely precise about every word. "You know what obstruction of legal process looks like. You know what following a document that was filed in bad faith makes you liable for. And you know that right now there are 4 witnesses watching what you decide to do in the next 30 seconds. Tate looked at Ethan. He looked at Amelia. He looked at Miguel, who was sitting his horse behind them with Roberto Garcia's rifle across his saddle. He looked at Clancy, who had the expression of a man who had lived too long to be frightened by other men's calculations. Tate put the paper away. "I'm going to have to report this," he said. "Report whatever you like," Amelia said. "Good morning, Deputy." She rode past him. The others followed. Behind her, she heard Tate say something to the other man, low and frustrated, and then the sound of both horses moving in the opposite direction. She kept her pace steady until they were a full mile past. Then she let out a breath. "He'll send word to Morse," Clancy said, pulling up beside her. "Of course he will," she said. "How far ahead does that put them?" "An hour, maybe less," Ethan said. "Morse will contact Langley's lawyer in the county seat. They'll try to file something that blocks the land office from receiving our contest." Can they do that in an hour? Not legally, Ethan said. But Morse has been doing things not entirely legally for a while now, and counting on nobody being able to prove it fast enough. She looked at him. Then we go faster. They pushed the horses hard for the next 30 miles. The Territorial Land Office opened its doors at precisely 8 o'clock, and Amelia Hartwell was the first person through them. The clerk behind the counter was a young man named Prescott, who had the organized, careful manner of someone who genuinely cared about the proper maintenance of records, which made him both an excellent land office clerk and exactly the right person to be facing right now. She placed the documents on his counter. I need to file a formal contest of a foreclosure notice filed yesterday by Gerald Morse of the Millhaven Territorial Bank, she said. The grounds are bad faith filing fraudulent documentation of the underlying legal rationale and coordinated land fraud between the filing party and an associate named Victor Langley, both of which are documented in the materials I am submitting. Prescott looked at the stack of documents. He looked at her. He looked at Ethan, who was standing at the door watching the street. He looked back at the documents. This is a significant filing, Mrs. Hartwell. Yes, she said. It is. I'll need to review the materials before... Take whatever time you need, she said. I'll wait. She sat down on the bench along the wall. She did not allow herself to watch the door. She watched Prescott instead, noting the way he moved through the documents with increasing attention, the way his expression shifted from professional neutrality to something more engaged, the way he twice stopped and went back to re-examine a specific filing. 20 minutes in, he looked up. Mrs. Hartwell, these bank filings, the ones tying Morse's institution to Langley's holding company, these are originals, certified copies from the county records office, she said. The originals are in county custody. And this transfer from 14 months ago shows the bank acting as escrow agent on a Langley acquisition that could only be legal if both parties had a prior undisclosed arrangement, she said, which constitutes bank fraud under Territorial Statute 47. Prescott stared at her. I've had 30 days to read the statutes, she said. He almost smiled. He went back to the documents. She was on her third hour of waiting when Ethan came away from the door and sat beside her on the bench. He didn't say anything. He sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and he directed his attention toward the window with the particular patient alertness that she had come to understand was simply how he inhabited space when he was waiting for something that mattered. She said quietly, "How bad is it outside?" 2 men arrived 20 minutes ago. They're waiting across the street. Langley's or Morse's, same answer as before. She kept her voice level. Are they going to try to stop us leaving? They're going to try something, he said. I don't know what yet. She looked at her hands. If this doesn't work today, it's going to work, he said. You don't know that. No, he said. But I know you've built the strongest possible case with what you had, and I know the clerk is on his 4th reread of that bank transfer filing, and I know that a federal judge in Cheyenne is waiting for word from us to move on his end. A pause. And I know that Morse and Langley built their whole strategy on the assumption that you were alone and couldn't sustain a fight this long. He looked at her. They were wrong about that. She held his gaze. They were wrong because of you, she said. They were wrong because of you, he corrected. I just stopped being a reason you had to do it alone. Prescott appeared at his counter. Mrs. Hartwell. She stood immediately. I've completed my initial review, Prescott said. The documentation you've provided is sufficient to initiate a formal hold on the foreclosure proceedings pending full review. I'm also required to note that the bank filings you've included suggest potential violations that fall outside my office's jurisdiction to adjudicate. He looked at her carefully. I will be forwarding a copy of these materials to the Territorial Attorney General's office as a matter of procedure. She exhaled slowly. How long does the formal hold last? 60 days minimum, Prescott said, during which time neither party can take action on the property. And the Attorney General's review? That timeline I cannot predict, he said. But given what you've submitted, I would expect them to move quickly. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Prescott. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, and something in his tone went slightly beyond professional courtesy. Your father filed his original land deed through this office 32 years ago. I've seen that record. It's a good piece of land, and it's been a good family on it. He looked at her steadily. I hope the review goes the way it should. She pressed her lips together. So do I, she said. She picked up her copies and turned to find Ethan already at the door reading the street before they stepped into it. He glanced at her. One look. She gave him one nod. They walked out together. The two men across the street watched them. Amelia walked to her horse without hurrying and without looking at the men directly, which was a technique she had developed over 3 years of being watched by men who wanted her to feel the weight of their observation. She was untying her horse when one of them crossed the street. He was the type she recognized, not a gunman, not like Ethan, but the kind of man hired for physical presence rather than skill, the kind that powerful men kept around to make rooms feel smaller. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, Mr. Langley would like to speak with you. Mr. Langley knows where my ranch is, she said pleasantly. He's welcome to make an appointment. He's in town, the man said. He'd appreciate a few minutes. I'm sure he would. She mounted her horse. The man put his hand on her bridle. Everything happened quickly after that. Ethan was off his horse and beside the man before she had time to react. Not with the revolver. His hand wasn't near it, but with his full physical presence, and the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was more frightening than aggression, the stillness of a man who had no uncertainty about what he was capable of and therefore no need to display it. Take your hand off her horse, Ethan said. Quietly. Precisely. The man looked at Ethan. He took his hand off the bridle. Tell Langley she'll be at her ranch, Ethan said. If he has legal business with her, he can conduct it through proper channels. If he shows up at her property unannounced again, I'll be the one who meets him at the gate. The man stepped back. They rode out. Clancy and Miguel fell in behind them at the pace that said they'd been watching every second and were glad it had gone the way it did. They were 2 miles out of town when Roberto Garcia appeared on the road ahead, riding toward them with the expression of a man who had spent the morning worrying. Well, he said, pulling up beside Amelia. Filed, she said. 60-day hold. Roberto's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. Elena is going to cry, he said. She's been in her kitchen praying since 6 this morning. Something tightened in Amelia's throat. Tell her thank you, she said. For all of it. Roberto looked at Ethan. The 2 men in town. Stood down, Ethan said. For now, Roberto said. For now, Ethan agreed. They rode back together, the 5 of them, and the road home felt different than it had that morning. Not easier, not finished, but changed in quality, the way the air changes after a storm that hasn't fully passed, but has at least shown you it can be weathered. Langley came to the ranch that evening, alone again, which told her the same thing it had told her the first time he was rattled and covering it with the performance of confidence. She met him at the gate. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, I heard you filed a contest this morning. I did. And you submitted documents to the land office alleging fraud. I submitted documented evidence of fraud, she said. There's a distinction. His pleasant expression was working harder than it had the first visit. You understand that these allegations, if pursued, will have consequences for everyone involved. Courts move slowly. Businesses suffer during reviews. Land values drop during disputes. He looked at her. Even for the people making the allegations. I grew up on contested land, she said. I know what a long fight looks like. Do you? He studied her. What do you want, Mrs. Hartwell? Seriously. Name it. The foreclosure disappears. The bank pressure stops. You keep your ranch unmolested. He spread his hands. I'm offering you peace. You're offering me silence, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Silence saves you 2 years of legal fighting, and saves you from a federal judge in Cheyenne who has been building a case against you for 8 months, she said. So let's be honest about what you're actually buying. The pleasant expression collapsed. Not into anger, into something colder. The real face underneath, she thought, which was not the face of a man who was angry, but the face of a man who was finally calculating correctly. "You contacted Reardon," he said. "Judge Reardon contacted us," she said. "Turns out we weren't the first people to notice your pattern." Langley looked at her for a long moment. He looked past her at Ethan, who was standing near the barn. He looked back at her. "You have made a significant enemy today," he said. "I had one already," she said. "Now at least it's official." He rode out. She watched him go. When his horse had cleared the tree line, she turned and walked toward Ethan, and she did it without deciding to the way she'd stopped deciding most things involving him. They simply happened organic and inevitable, like water finding its level. "He knows about Reardon," she said. "He knew before he came," Ethan said. "He came to see if you'd be scared." "Was I?" He looked at her. "No." She stood beside him and looked at the gate where Langley had just ridden through. And she thought about all the men who had come through that gate in the last 30 days, intending to intimidate her into surrender, and about how each of them had left with something they hadn't expected, the discovery that she would not be surrendered. "What happens now?" she asked. "Reardon moves," Ethan said. "He has our documents. He has the land office filing. He has everything he needs to convene a federal review." He paused. "It won't be fast, but it'll be thorough." "And Morse?" "Morse is in a very difficult position," Ethan said. "He filed a fraudulent foreclosure notice, and the land office just formally documented the fraudulent basis for it. Even if Langley's legal people can slow Reardon down, Morse's banking license is in serious jeopardy." She absorbed this. "The other families. Garcia and Sutton and the Parks are all part of the formal record now," Ethan said. "Reardon's review will cover all of them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What about you?" He looked at her. "What about me?" "Langley will use your history," she said. "He'll argue that the legal arrangement we filed was fraudulent specifically because of who you are. He's already started that argument through Morse." "He can try," Ethan said. "There's no outstanding warrant. There's no criminal record in this territory. And the arrangement we filed is legally sound regardless of my history." "But he'll make it public," she said. "Everything you were. Everything you did." "It's already public," Ethan said. "It's been public since the day I walked into this town. The only question was whether people cared more about my past than my present." He looked at her steadily. "Some of them will. Some of them already do. That's not something I can fix." She held his gaze. "Does it bother you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "It would be easier if it didn't. But I've made my peace with the fact that there are things I've done that I can't undo. I can only do different things now and hope that eventually the now outweighs the before." She was quiet. "Thomas told me something," Ethan said after a moment. "When I was at his place those weeks after I left Decker, he said—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to say it. Then, he said most men define themselves by their worst moment because it's the most dramatic. He said the smarter thing was to define yourself by the direction you're moving. She thought about that. She thought about a man in Montana who had taken in a hired gun with no strings attached and died 3 years later with enough faith in that man to send him to protect the most important thing in his life. He was right, she said. He usually was, Ethan said. She looked at him. He looked at her, and she did something she hadn't fully planned, which was to reach out and put her hand on his arm, not dramatically, not with the weight of everything she felt about him. Just her hand on his arm for a moment, the way you touched something real to confirm it was there. He went very still. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. "I meant what I said this morning," she said. "When this is over, I want you to stay. Not because of the deed. Not because of the bank. Because—" She stopped. Because she was an honest woman, and honesty sometimes required finishing the sentence, even when finishing it was the harder thing. "Because you are the first person in 3 years who has stood beside me without trying to stand over me. And because I have spent 30 days trying to find a reason that isn't enough, and I've run out of reasons." He was very quiet. "I'm not an easy person," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll argue with you." "I expect you will." "I won't change how I run this ranch." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "It's a well-run ranch." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then something happened to his face. The particular thing that happened when the long-held tension of a man who has been carrying something very heavy finally carefully puts it down. Not collapse. Release. The face of a man who has been waiting for permission to believe something good and has just received it. "I'm not the man you planned for," he said quietly. "No," she said. "You're not." He waited. "You're the man who showed up," she said, "and stayed, and that turned out to matter more." He covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not with declarations or speeches or the performance of emotion. Just his hand over hers, warm and steady, and present the way he was with everything that mattered. They stood like that at the gate of her ranch in the fading light. Behind them, from the direction of the barn, they heard Clancy make some unnecessary noise that was unmistakably the sound of a man announcing his presence to give two people a moment he'd been waiting 3 weeks to give them. Amelia almost laughed. Ethan's hand tightened slightly on hers. She let it. Yeah, the week that followed was not peaceful. Peace was not a thing that arrived all at once on the frontier. It came in installments, partial and provisional, earned one day at a time. Langley's lawyers filed 3 separate motions in the next 5 days, each designed to delay, complicate, and cloud the record that Prescott at the land office had accepted and forwarded. Each motion was answered by Amelia through her notary Henry Pratt, who had apparently decided that the Hartwell case was the most interesting thing to cross his desk in 15 years, and was applying himself to it with unusual zeal. By the Garcia family, who provided a sworn statement about the bank pressure they'd received. By May Sutton, who dictated a 2-page account to Elena Garcia and signed it in a hand that shook with age, but not with uncertainty. By Judge Reardon in Cheyenne, whose office sent a formal notice to the Territorial Land Office that expanded the scope of the federal review to include all properties identified in Amelia's documentation. Morse made a mistake. It was the kind of mistake that frightened men made when they felt the ground shifting. He contacted Prescott directly and suggested that the documents submitted by Amelia Hartwell might have been altered before submission. Prescott, who cared very much about the integrity of his records, immediately filed a report with the Territorial Attorney General documenting the contact. Ethan heard about it from Sheriff Aldous Cole, who appeared at the ranch one morning with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for a reason to stop pretending that what Morse and Langley were doing was anything other than what it was. "Morse is finished," Cole said. "He doesn't know it yet, but he is." "And Langley?" Amelia asked. Cole looked at Ethan. "The federal review will take time, but Reardon is thorough. What you gave him?" He shook his head. "It's enough. It's more than enough." She looked at Cole. "Why are you telling us this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I should have told Morse no 6 months ago," he said. "And I didn't. And that's something I have to live with." He looked at Amelia directly. "But I'm telling you now." She nodded. She thought about direction, about defining yourself by where you were moving. She thought about the way the people around her had been given small moments to choose differently, and some of them had taken those moments and some hadn't, and how that turned out to be the real story, underneath the legal story, not the land, not the money, not the powerful men and their designs, but the ordinary question of what people did when they had to decide who they were going to be. Cole rode out. Ethan was sitting at her kitchen table. He had started sitting at her kitchen table over the past week. Not as a presumption, but as the natural drift of two people who kept ending up in the same place, because that was where the work was, and also where the conversation was, and also, if they were honest with both themselves and each other, where they wanted to be. She poured coffee. She sat across from him. "Clancy told me you fixed the south fence this morning," she said. "It needed it." Clancy also said you've been teaching Danny how to assess water levels at the creek markers. Kid's smart, Ethan said. He learns fast. She looked at him. You're building something here. He met her eyes. Trying to. Not just for me, she said. For yourself. He held her gaze. Yes. She nodded slowly. There was something she had been thinking about for several days and had not said because she hadn't been sure of the right words, but she was an honest woman, and honest women eventually found the words. When Thomas wrote to me, she said, he said he couldn't promise he'd be the man I hoped for, only the man I needed. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I've been thinking about that. And I think Thomas couldn't have been the man I needed, she said. He would have been good and kind and honest, and I would have been grateful to him my whole life. She looked up. But he would have been a partner in a legal arrangement. And that's not... She stopped. That's not what I have with you. He was very still. What do you have with me? He asked. Someone I think about when he's not in the room, she said. Someone I trust with the things I never trusted anyone with. Someone who has seen me at my worst days and my most frightened moments, and who has not once used either one against me. She held his gaze. I have someone I want to know for the rest of my life. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn. Somewhere in the far pasture, cattle moved. The ordinary sounds of a working ranch continuing to exist. Ethan set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had first seen as giving nothing away, and had come to understand gave everything away to someone who knew how to look. I'm going to be honest with you, he said. I'd expect nothing less. I came here owing a debt, he said. And I told myself that was all it was, a debt to a good man and the woman he trusted. He paused. I stopped being able to tell myself that around the 14th day. She thought about the 14th day. She had locked her front door for the first time in 2 years. What happened on the 14th day? She asked. You came outside after I left the revolver on the bunkhouse step, he said, and you looked at it, and you didn't say anything about it. And I understood that you had calculated what it meant and made room for it anyway, and I thought... He stopped. I thought that was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a very long time. She looked at him. I'm not easy either, he said. I have a past that's going to come up for the rest of my life. I have habits built from years and situations that weren't like this. I will probably make decisions sometimes that are based on reflexes from that life. He looked at her steadily. But I will never lie to you, and I will never put myself above you, and I will never stop trying to be the man that Thomas thought I could be. She thought about Thomas Reed. She thought about a man who spent a month with a stranger and saw something worth sending forward into the future. He knew, she said. He knew. Ethan agreed. She stood up. She picked up her coat. We have 40 head to move to the south pasture before dark, she said. He stood up. Yes, ma'am, he said. And there was something in those 2 words, the familiar, steady cadence of them, that was completely different from what they had meant 6 weeks ago on a train platform when he'd said them to a woman who wanted to send him away. She went out the door. He followed 3 steps behind. Not because she needed him there, because they were going the same direction. The federal summons arrived on a Wednesday. It came by official courier from Cheyenne, a young man in a territorial marshal's uniform who had clearly ridden hard and was trying not to show it, and it was addressed not just to Amelia Hartwell, but to Victor Langley, Gerald Morse, and the Western Territorial Holdings Company, care of the county courthouse. The courier handed Amelia her copy personally and told her that Judge Reardon's review hearing had been scheduled for 3 weeks from Friday. She read it standing at the gate, then she read it again. Then she walked inside, set it on her father's table, and sat down quietly with her hands in her lap, and allowed herself for the first time since the train platform 6 weeks ago to feel something that was not planning or fighting or calculating. She felt the beginning of relief. Not the full thing, not yet, not with 3 weeks still standing between her and whatever Reardon's hearing would decide, but the edge of it, the first breath of it. The way relief feels when it's still fragile and you're almost afraid to name it because naming it might make it conditional. Ethan came in from the barn. He saw her face. He sat down across from her without asking. She pushed the summons across the table. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he agreed. Langley will spend those 3 weeks trying to discredit everything we submitted. He will. And Morse will cooperate with him because at this point their best defense is a shared one. Yes. She looked at the summons. Reardon will want testimony, not just documents. He'll want people to stand up in a federal proceeding and say what happened to them. Elena and Roberto have already said they'll do it, Ethan said. May Sutton said, and I'm quoting Clancy, who heard it from Elena. She said the day she was too old to tell a federal judge, the truth was the day they could put her in the ground. Something moved through Amelia's chest that was part laughter and part something older and deeper. That sounds like May. Danny Park's father wants to come too, Ethan said. He found out about the coordinated pressure on the families, and apparently he has a few things to say about it. She absorbed all of this. We're not alone in this. No, he said. We're not. She looked at him across her father's table, and she thought about the version of this moment she would have had 6 weeks ago alone with a different set of documents that weren't good enough without the Garcia family, or May Sutton, or Clancy's steadiness, or Roberto's rifle across his son's saddle, or a federal judge in Cheyenne who had been doing his own work all along. She thought about Thomas Reed. She thought about how much was different because of a dying man's last decision. I want to visit his grave, she said. Ethan looked at her. Thomas, she said. Before the hearing, I want to go to Montana and... She stopped. I want to tell him what happened. I know that's... It's not foolish, Ethan said quietly. It's right. She looked at him. He'd want to know, Ethan said. He was the kind of man who'd want to know. She nodded. After the hearing, she said. After the hearing, he agreed. She picked up the summons and folded it precisely and placed it on top of the document stack that had become a permanent fixture of her kitchen table over the past 3 weeks. Then she stood and put on her coat and went back to work. Because the ranch did not stop for federal summonses, any more than it stopped for anything else. And there were 40 head in the south pasture and fences to check, and a water level at the North Creek marker that Danny had flagged as needing monitoring. She was halfway to the barn when Ethan said from behind her, Amelia. She turned. He was standing in the doorway of the house with the afternoon light behind him and the expression on his face that she had learned to read as him, deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking or the easier thing. He said the actual thing. Whatever happens at the hearing, he said, I need you to know that the last 6 weeks have been the best 6 weeks of my life, not because of any of what we've been fighting, because of who I've been fighting it with. She stood in the yard and looked at him. She thought about all the things she could say in response to that, the practical things, the careful things, the honest but measured things that would acknowledge what he'd said without being vulnerable to it. She said none of them. I know, she said. Same. She went to the barn. She heard him follow 3 steps back. She was smiling before she reached the door. The 3 weeks moved with the particular quality of time that passed during sustained tension fast in the days which were full of work and preparation, and the back and forth of legal correspondence, and slow in the nights which were quieter and carried more weight. Langley's lawyers filed 7 motions. Pratt, who had found a second wind of professional zeal that Amelia suspected he would be dining out on for the rest of his career, answered all 7. Morse made 2 attempts to have the land office's formal hold reviewed on grounds of procedural error. Prescott, who had apparently taken the suggestion that his records might have been tampered with as a personal offense, responded to both attempts with the kind of meticulous bulletproof documentation that made it clear he had been building his own case since the day Morse made that phone call. Sheriff Cole quietly suspended Deputy Tate pending the outcome of the federal review, and did not explain why and did not need to. 3 other families in the county people Amelia had not known were part of the pattern contacted Reardon's office after word spread through the network that Elena Garcia had activated without anyone asking her to activate it. Those families added their names to the federal record. And on the ranch through all of it, the work continued. Cattle moved. Fences were maintained. The mare Duchess ran the north pasture with a stride that had no hitch in it at all. Danny Park learned to read the creek markers and started teaching the youngest of the other hands how to do the same the way knowledge moved on a working ranch, sideways and practical and without ceremony. On the evening of the 14th day, Amelia and Ethan sat on the porch steps after supper with coffee cups and the silence that had become their most comfortable shared language, and Clancy came out of the bunkhouse and settled himself into the chair he had apparently designated as his chair, without anyone agreeing to this arrangement, and the 3 of them sat in the cooling evening air and didn't say much of anything. After a while, Clancy said, "Your father used to sit out here evenings." Amelia looked at him. "I know. Used to say the best thing about the end of a day's work was that the work was done." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Said everything else could wait till morning. She thought about her father. She thought about him sitting on this porch step 30 years ago, with the same land stretching out the same direction in the same evening light. And she wondered if he had ever imagined a morning that looked like this one was building toward his daughter. On the same step, with a man beside her, who was nothing she had planned for and everything she hadn't known to plan for. She thought he would have liked Ethan. She thought he would have asked direct questions and received direct answers and made his assessment quickly and without revision, the way he did everything. And she thought the assessment would have been the same one that Clancy and Roberto Garcia and May Sutton and even Henry Pratt, the notary, had arrived at through different routes, that this was a man trying hard to become something better than what he'd been, and that trying hard and in the right direction was ultimately the only credential that mattered. "Dad would have liked you," she said. Ethan looked at her. "I think he'd have given you about 3 days before he decided," she said. "And then he'd have found something to fix together so he could work beside you and make his assessment without it looking like an assessment." "What would he have fixed?" "The south fence," she said immediately. "He fixed the south fence 6 times in 20 years. Every time he needed to think through something important, he went and found a reason the south fence needed fixing." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I fixed the south fence on the 3rd day." "I know," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the evening. Clancy made the same unnecessary noise he had made 2 weeks ago near the barn, and stood up and said he thought he'd turn in, and the sound of the bunkhouse door closing behind him was so deliberately polite that it almost made her laugh. "3 weeks ago you said you wanted me to stay," Ethan said after a moment. "I remember." "I didn't answer you properly." She looked at him. "You covered my hand with yours." "That's not an answer," he said. "It answered everything I asked," she said. He turned toward her on the step. He was not a man who made grand gestures or spoke in the large, dramatic language of men who were performing emotion rather than feeling it. When he spoke seriously, he spoke plainly, and she had come to understand that his plainness was not a limitation, but a precision. He said exactly what he meant, because he meant exactly what he said. "I want to stay," he said. "Not because of the deed or the hearing or the promise I made to Thomas. Because this is the first place in my adult life that has felt like a place I was supposed to be." He held her gaze. "And you are the first person who has ever made me feel like who I'm becoming matters more than who I was." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then stay," she said. He nodded. She put her hand over his, the way he had put his hand over hers 2 weeks ago at the gate, and they sat on the porch step in the darkening evening like 2 people who had arrived at something through the hardest possible route and found it waiting for them exactly where they'd stopped fighting it. The hearing was held on a Friday in early June. The courthouse in the county seat had not seen a proceeding of this scope in 11 years, which fact Amelia knew, because the courthouse clerk had told her while she waited in the hallway with the particular conversational energy of someone who found historical context soothing during tense moments and was not entirely wrong about that. She sat with Ethan on one side and Henry Pratt on the other, with Elena and Roberto Garcia directly behind her, and May Sutton 2 rows back in the chair that Elena had carried in from the hallway, because the existing seating had not accounted for a 73-year-old woman who walked with a cane and was not going to be left out of this proceeding for any reason. Langley sat across the room with 2 lawyers. Morse sat beside him, and he looked for the first time in Amelia's experience of him like a man who understood that the ground had shifted in a way that could not be unshifted. Judge Reardon was 61 years old, with the kind of face that conveyed long experience with human nature without having developed contempt for it, which Amelia thought was a remarkable achievement for someone who had spent 30 years in federal courts. He opened the proceedings with the specific methodical clarity of a man who intended to cover every relevant point and was not going to be hurried. He had read everything. That became clear within the first 10 minutes. He referenced documents by their filing dates and their specific language. He asked questions that demonstrated not just familiarity with the record, but deep comprehension of its structure, the way the Western Territorial Holdings Company connected to Morse's bank, the specific timeline of the pressure applied to each family, the sequential nature of the land acquisition strategy that made it undeniably a coordinated scheme rather than a series of coincidental events. Langley's lead lawyer attempted 3 times to introduce arguments about the character of witnesses. The third time, he made the mistake of referencing Ethan's history directly. He said, in the careful language of a man who had prepared this point, "The testimony of a former hired gun with a documented history of working outside the law should be weighed accordingly by this court." Reardon looked at the lawyer over the top of his glasses. "Counsel Thier," he said, "the documentation submitted in this case was drawn from county land records, bank transaction filings, and territorial court documents. It was verified by this court's own investigators before this hearing was convened. The character of the person who identified those documents has no bearing on whether the documents are authentic." A pause. "They are authentic. I've verified that myself." The lawyer sat down. Amelia did not look at Ethan, but she felt him beside her exhale slowly. May Sutton gave testimony that lasted 14 minutes and required no prompting, and concluded with her saying directly to Langley across the courtroom, "I have lived on that land for 41 years, and I will not be moved from it by a man who has never done an honest day's work in his life," which was technically outside the scope of formal testimony, but which Reardon allowed to stand in the record. Elena Garcia's testimony was precise and devastating, in the manner of a woman who remembered every detail of every conversation she had ever had about the bank pressure on her family, and recounted them in exact chronological order. Roberto's testimony was shorter. He simply described what had happened in plain language without embellishment or emotion, which was somehow more powerful than either. Danny Park's father, a compact, quiet man named James, who ran his property with the same steady care his son applied to everything, stood up at the end of the witness portion and said, "My family has been in this county for 9 years. We came out here because we were told that a man who worked hard could keep what he built. I'd like to know if that's still true." Reardon looked at him. "That," the judge said, "is precisely what we're here to determine." Langley's lawyers delivered their defense for 2 hours. They were good lawyers, and they made the arguments that good lawyers make when the evidence is against them. Procedural objections, questions of jurisdiction, character attacks on witnesses, appeals to the complexity of business arrangements that merely appeared improper but were in fact legitimate. Reardon listened to all of it with complete attention and no visible reaction. Then he called a recess. The recess lasted 47 minutes. Amelia stood in the courthouse hallway with Ethan beside her and Pratt making careful notes in his ledger, and Elena Garcia holding her hand with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who had decided that hand-holding was the appropriate response to waiting and was going to do it whether it was asked for or not. Amelia let her. She looked at the courthouse wall. She thought about her father. She thought about the first letter Thomas Reed had ever sent her, the careful, cramped handwriting, the 3 pages that had taken him effort to produce, because he was not a man who wrote often, but took it seriously when he did. She thought about the line, "I cannot promise I will be the man you hoped for, but I can promise I will try to be the man you need." She thought about how Thomas had written those words about himself and sent them to her, and how in the end they had described someone else entirely, and how she was no longer certain whether the universe arranged things or whether people did, and how the distinction mattered less than she used to think it did. Ethan was looking at the wall beside her. She said very quietly, "Whatever happens in there." He looked at her. "Whatever happens," she said, "I need you to know that I would do all of it again. Every day of it." He held her gaze. "So would I," he said, "starting with walking off that train." She pressed her lips together against the thing that wanted to rise in her chest. Elena Garcia squeezed her hand. The courthouse doors opened. Reardon's ruling was 43 pages long. He did not read all of it. He summarized the core findings in plain language that left no ambiguity about what had happened or what would follow. The Western Territorial Holdings Company had engaged in coordinated land fraud across 7 properties in the county over a period of 18 months. The scheme had been conducted with the knowing participation of Gerald Morse and the Millhaven Territorial Bank, whose actions constituted violations of territorial banking law, federal fraud statutes, and the legal obligations owed to depositors and borrowers under his institution's charter. The foreclosure notice filed against Amelia Hartwell was voided in its entirety. The bank holds on the Garcia property, the Sutton property, the Park property, and 4 additional properties identified in the extended review were voided. Gerald Morse's banking license was suspended pending criminal investigation. Victor Langley and the Western Territorial Holdings Company were ordered to appear before a federal grand jury within 60 days. Reardon looked up from his summary. He looked at Amelia. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "your land is yours. It has always been yours. The actions taken against you were fraudulent from their inception, and this court's finding reflects that fact clearly and permanently." The courtroom was silent for one long moment. Then May Sutton said in a voice that carried perfectly despite her 73 years, "Well, it's about time." The room erupted. Amelia sat completely still in the middle of it. She heard Elena crying beside her, heard Roberto's voice saying something in Spanish that she recognized as a prayer his mother had taught him. She heard Clancy, who had slipped into the back row sometime during the proceedings without announcing himself, make the sound of a man who was absolutely not crying and would deny it to his grave. She heard Pratt saying, "Yes, yes, yes," in quiet succession, the way people did when something they hoped for arrived and turned out to be real. She sat still. Ethan put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the middle of the noise and the movement and the extraordinary ordinary joy of people who had been afraid for a long time and were no longer afraid, they looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have been through the hardest thing together and come out the other side and know, without saying it, that this is the moment they will remember when they are old. "Thomas would have loved this," she said. "He would have been insufferably pleased with himself," Ethan said. She laughed. It came out of her fully, not held back, not measured, the real laugh of a woman who had not laughed that way in 3 years, and discovered that the capacity for it had been there all along, waiting for a reason. Ethan looked at her like that was the best thing he had ever seen. They went to Montana in July. It was a 4-day ride, and they made it together, just the two of them, with the horses moving easy through the summer landscape and the particular quality of freedom that came from traveling without urgency after months of moving under pressure. Thomas Reed was buried in a small cemetery outside the town where he had spent his last years, under a marker that his neighbors had put up in the simple, practical way of frontier communities. Plain stone full name dates and the single word "good" that someone had added below the dates, and that Amelia thought was the most honest epitaph she had ever seen. She stood at the grave for a long time. She told him what had happened. She told him about the documents and the hearing and Reardon's ruling. She told him about the Garcia family and May Sutton and Danny Park, and Clancy sitting in the back of the courtroom not crying. She told him about Prescott at the land office, and Sheriff Cole, and even Margaret Caulfield, who had come to her door with a pie 2 weeks after the hearing, a real pie, not a pretext, and sat at her kitchen table for an hour and talked the way two women could talk when the performance layer was finally gone. She told him that the ranch was safe. She told him that she understood now what he had done with his last breath, and that she was in the complicated position of having to be grateful for something that had required his death to give her, which was the kind of gratitude that didn't sit easily, but sat honestly. She told him she was happy. She said that last part quietly with Ethan standing a respectful distance behind her, and she felt the truth of it as she said it. Not the fragile, provisional near happiness she had let herself approach over the past weeks, but the real thing settled, and sure, the kind that came from choosing rather than from hoping. She stepped back. Ethan moved to the grave. He stood quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I kept the promise, and I think you knew what you were doing." He paused. "I think you knew who I could be better than I did." He was quiet for a moment. "I won't waste it." They rode back the next morning. The summer moved into fall, and fall moved toward winter, and the ranch moved with the seasons, the way ranches did, the rhythm of it, unchanged and unchangeable, the work that was always there, the land that asked the same things of you, in the same order every year. But things were different. Not in the work was the same work, but in the texture of the days, the weight of them, the way mornings felt when you were not carrying them alone. Ethan Blackwood became in the quiet and undramatic way of things that were simply right part of the Hartwell Ranch. Not its owner, not its manager, its partner. In the precise and equitable sense that Amelia had always meant when she used the word someone who stood beside, not over who contributed, without claiming who brought his particular skills and history and hard-won knowledge to something larger than himself, and found that the something larger was better for having him, and he was better for being part of it. He still sat on the porch step evenings. She joined him most nights. They argued about water rights and cattle rotations, and the best way to handle the north pasture in winter, and their arguments were good ones, the kind that produced better decisions than either would have made alone. And sometimes they agreed before the end, and sometimes they didn't, and either way the ranch was the better for it. Clancy retired in November. He did it the way he did everything without announcement, by simply appearing at the kitchen door one evening with his hat in his hands and saying he thought he'd earned a rest, and there was a cousin in Colorado he hadn't seen in 12 years. Amelia hugged him, which surprised them both. He accepted it with the gruff, moved silence of a man for whom affection was always somewhat unexpected and therefore more valuable. He shook Ethan's hand for a long time at the gate. "You did right by her," Clancy said. "She did right by herself," Ethan said. "I just stopped being a reason she had to do it alone." Clancy looked at him. "Same thing," he said. "Out here, that's the same thing." He rode south. Danny Park took over as head ranch hand, which surprised no one who had been watching, and his father came by the week after to shake Amelia's hand and say he was glad, and she was glad too. Margaret Caulfield became over the months that followed something that surprised Amelia more than most things, a genuine friend. Not the complicated layered acquaintance of the years before, but a real friendship built on the foundation of Margaret having made a wrong choice and then made a better one, and Amelia having accepted both. It was the kind of friendship that frontier living occasionally produced, direct, honest, based on mutual respect for the difficulty of things and the decision to face that difficulty without pretense. May Sutton visited in December. She sat at Amelia's kitchen table and drank coffee and looked at Ethan with the direct, unadorned assessment of a 73-year-old woman who had outlived too much to bother with subtlety. "You're good for her," she said. Ethan looked at May. "I'm trying to be." "Stop trying," May said. "You are. Own it." Amelia looked at her coffee cup. Ethan said, "Yes, ma'am." May looked at Amelia. "Your father would have approved." "I know," Amelia said. "I told him once, long time ago, I told him you were going to be the toughest thing about this land," May said. "He thought I meant it as a complaint. I meant it as a compliment." She looked between them. "He would have liked to see this." Amelia held that thought carefully, the way you held things that were both painful and precious. He would have fixed the south fence with Ethan, she said, and pretended it wasn't an interview. May laughed. Ethan looked at Amelia. She looked back at him. On a morning in the spring of the following year, Amelia Hartwell stood at the north fence of her ranch and looked at land that was entirely and permanently hers. The federal proceedings had concluded in February. Langley had been convicted on 4 counts of land fraud and 1 count of federal conspiracy and was no longer a presence in Wyoming territory in any capacity. Morse had surrendered his banking license as part of a settlement that also required full restitution to every family his actions had harmed. A new bank manager had arrived in Millhaven, a careful professional woman named Ruth Adler, which was itself a thing that would have seemed impossible a year ago, and now simply seemed like a fact of the present, which was where facts lived. The Garcia family was safe on their land. May Sutton was safe on hers. The Park family was safe on theirs. 4 other families Amelia had not known before this fight were safe on theirs. She stood at the fence and felt the cold spring air and listened to the ranch working behind her, the sounds she had heard every morning of her life, cattle and horses and men and the persistent necessary business of keeping a place alive. And she thought about the morning 1 year ago, when she had put on her blue dress and stood at a train station and felt hope for the first time in 3 years. She thought about what hope had looked like then, a quiet man from Montana, and his simple, honest letters, and the gap between his front teeth that showed when he smiled. She thought about what hope looked like now. Ethan appeared at the fence beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He stood at the fence and looked at the same land she was looking at, and she understood that this was what it meant to have someone who stood beside you. Not the dramatic moments, not the courthouse and the federal judge and the documents and the victory, but this, the ordinary morning, the shared silence, the simple fact of being at the same fence, looking at the same horizon, and knowing you were not alone in it. She thought about the train station. She thought about turning to see a tall man with a scar and a gun and gray eyes that told her nothing. She thought about saying I wanted a husband, not a gunslinger, and meaning it absolutely in the moment she said it. She thought about everything that word husband had meant to her, then safety, legal standing, practical protection, survival. A transaction. A necessity. The unsentimental calculus of a woman who had decided that love was not something she had time for. She looked at Ethan. He turned and looked at her. And she thought I was right that morning at the station. I didn't want a gunslinger. I wanted someone who would show up and stay and keep his word and stand beside me without standing over me and tell me the truth, and be gentle with the things that were hurt, and be patient with the things that were afraid, and be brave enough to try to become better than the worst thing he had ever done. I wanted all of that. I just didn't know that was what I was asking for. And the man who walked off that train knew it before I did. She turned back to the fence. South fence needs checking, she said. Ethan looked at the south fence. He looked at her. I'll get the tools, he said. He went. She stayed at the north fence a moment longer. She thought about Thomas Reed's grave in Montana and the word good carved into plain stone, and the man who had spent a month getting a stranger back on his feet with no strings, and died with enough faith in that stranger to send him forward into the future. She thought, thank you. She meant it the way you meant things that were too large for words, but that words were all you had. Then she pushed off the fence and went to meet Ethan at the south end of the property, walking across the land that was hers in the cold spring morning of a year that was already better than the last, toward a man who had arrived as the wrong answer and turned out to be the only one that was ever going to be right. Because that was what Thomas Reed had understood in his last days with the clarity that sometimes came to dying men who had spent their lives paying close attention to people, that the right answer rarely looked like what you asked for, and the right person rarely arrived the way you planned. And the life worth living was almost never the one you had outlined so carefully in letters and sent off to a stranger in Montana. It was the one that showed up instead, unexpected, imperfect, carrying a past and a promise, and a pair of gray eyes that told you nothing until they told you everything. It was the one that stayed. And on the Hartwell Ranch in the spring of 1887, on land that had held one family's name for 32 years, and would hold it for 32 more, that life was exactly what it was chosen kept, and entirely permanently home.